Greetings ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Hylian, and welcome to my brief analysis on the new trailer for the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, before we begin, it's important to make some small remarks regarding this video, as it differs in the style of content from my usual one present in my channel. Firstly, this video is unscripted for the most part. The only thing I have in front of me is 2 sheets of paper with a flowchart of ideas that shall be covered in this video. It should be evident by this design that this video is drastically different in structure and approach compared to my previous video in this channel, A Living Legacy, A Journey Through Final Fantasy VII. If you're unfamiliar with the video in question, I highly suggest you check it out, as it's not only something that I've spent months of hard work and poured my heart and soul into it, but it's also something that should be relevant for you if you're interested in this channel, as it paints not only a good picture of what to expect of the content in this channel moving forward, but it also serves as a good introduction for yours truly and the type of approach that I have with analysis in general. And considering you're watching this video, I assume that you're a Legend of Zelda fan, and thus, I assume that the game in question should be entertaining to you at the very least. So again, I highly suggest you check it out in full. On the other hand, to those who are coming off the heels from the first video that I've made, I should give you a quick heads up about the contents of this video. This video is not structured, nor poses a similar type of referencing as seen in my Final Fantasy VII video. The analysis of this trailer is based on my own experience and knowledge of the Legend of Zelda series, and such experience comes from the localized versions of the titles in the series made available in the West thus far. As a refresher, my preferred approach to analyzing media is to consider all of the contents of the work at hand in the most faithful form possible. In the cases of works that weren't produced in the English language originally, it is important, no, it is vital to analyze said media with a translation that is as faithful as possible to the contents that the original creators wanted to convey to their audience, be it dialogue, presentation, imagery, etc. Coming off from my Final Fantasy VII video, you should be aware of Japanese games being prone to bad translations. This has been prevalent in the 1980s and 1990s, but this is still an issue that plagues the medium to this day. One of the greatest examples of this is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, a game that suffered significant translation issues to the point of causing drastic changes to the presentation of character as well as certain lore details. One of which, ironically, contradicts what the trailers for the sequel seem to suggest as the core of the premise for the story to take place.
Ganon was born out of a dark past. He is a pure embodiment of the ancient evil that is reborn time and time again. He has given up on reincarnation and assumed his pure, enraged form.
I mean, not only the Japanese dialogue points to the exact opposite of what was said in the English version, I don't know about you guys, but the man here doesn't really seem to be giving up on resurrection, just saying. With this, you might start to get the full picture of the situation. Differently from analyzing Final Fantasy VII, a self-contained work, analyzing The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and its sequel demands considering them as part of an interconnected series. While the game's story takes place in the distant future, lore details that are relevant for the game originate from earlier games in the series. With this in mind, it should be made evident that translation issues in past games could result in a snowball effect that harms the very understanding of the series itself and the veracity of the information being concluded by analysis like this one. In conclusion, due to the large amount of translated material needed to be verified firsthand and the Herculean task of researching everything involved, the basis for analysis and speculation present in this video won't be taking into account the most accurate translation of the Japanese version of the games. So I hope you understand, fair viewer. Now, before we actually begin, I want to add some small remarks. This video analyzes a trailer, and as such, I should be making clear that analyzing trailers is not going to be the standard for this channel. I'm analyzing the E3 2021 trailer for the sequel to Breath of the Wild simply because this is an opportunity for me to talk about the game. I have huge plans for this channel's future when it comes to handling the Legend of Zelda series. I'll be covering numerous topics about it, as well as analyzing some specific games in the series. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild should be one of those very games. However, if my Final Fantasy VII video should serve as any indicator for you, you should be able to realize that the video series tackling the specific Legend of Zelda games will be featuring a similar amount of researching, scripting and redrafting, as well as video editing, and thus it will take quite some time before I formally analyze the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. With all of this in mind, analyzing this trailer is an opportunity for me to talk about this game long before my analysis series truly begins. And of course, it should serve as a taste for you, the viewer, of the Zelda content that this channel will be aiming to produce in the long run. After all, if you haven't noticed already, the very alias that I took for this channel's endeavor reflects the very love that I have for this series. With all of that said, let's begin the analysis of the E3 2021 trailer for the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The trailer begins as it fades into a frame showing a dark environment. As Malice slowly takes over the screen, we get a glimpse of two different scenes that might serve as the very premise for the adventure to take place. Let's look at the very first one that shows Link having his right arm be consumed by Malice. There are a couple of things to take from this sequence. For starters, this seems to parallel the very first trailer, where we see Link's right arm be consumed by a green essence. We do not know the nature of it yet, but it seems to be tied to the green magic that is sealing the corpse of what looks to be Ganondorf. Considering that Malice is an ethereal form of evil itself and serves as an extension of Ganondorf's influence to the world, this parallel is an interesting one because the sealing magic serves to counter this exact form of energy, going by the first trailer already extensively analyzed by Zelda theorists on YouTube. And this relationship between these parties is what makes me think that these two scenes might be related in some form. Considering the later parts of the trailer, it's reasonable to conclude that the green essence is what ends up being the last energy to consume Link's arm. I'll explain this better later. For now, allow me to theorize on what this scene points to in terms of continuity. Going by the previous trailer, it seems that Link and Zelda search for the source of malice that could rise as the calamity in the future, finding the corpse of Ganondorf sealed by a magic green hand carrying a Golden Gauntlet. The fact that Malice is leaking shows that the seal is losing its power. With that trailer ending with the resurrection of Ganondorf's corpse, it's easy to conclude that the seal itself was broken by some event, most likely related to our heroes, and I believe this event is shown quickly by this new trailer. I believe that Ganondorf's malice attacks Link as he gets close and it tries to consume him. As an immediate reaction to this ensuing threat and shift in concentration of malice, the hand that seals the corpse leaves its place to nullify the malice, giving Link the gauntlet and the powers that come from it, as seen later on in this trailer. If you think there might be a continuity of events that makes more sense, please share in the comments. Moving on, there is a small detail in the scene that I also think is visually neat. As Malice consumes Link's arm, you can see what looks to be a large hand of Malice, further enhancing it as both a symbolic and literal extension of Ganondorf himself while his body is sealed. Finally, this should serve as a nice transition into a topic that this single shot reinforces to some degree. Since the unveiling of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild back in 2014, it has been relatively common to see people make comparisons between the game and Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke. When looking at both works, it's understandable to see why people make these connections. Both share a colorful art style and art direction, emphasizing the beauty of landscapes. Both show a dichotomy of technology versus nature. The threat of the apocalypse is a significant element for the central conflict in the stories, as well as some specific parallels in imagery. And it seems that this continues with this new trailer. Ashitaka, the protagonist of Princess Mononoke, like Link, is attacked by a demonic beast as it tries to consume him through his right arm. Throughout the rest of the film, Ashitaka deals with this event as the remnants of said evil starts to consume him while granting him powers of strength and resistance. This parallel has led some fans to believe the same plot point will repeat in the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and to that I have some comments to make. If you take the context surrounding Breath of the Wild and Mononoke into account, the comparisons between these two works lose their strength and appeal, as these elements possess different roles and meaning in their respective stories. It is more likely that the film served as a vague inspiration rather than a significant one when conceiving the games in question. And thus, it's more likely that this parallel will be restricted to momentary imagery and won't be relevant to the story, much like the rest of the parallels made in the past. And finally, like I said previously, we do see throughout the rest of the trailer that his arm ends up in a state closer to what the green magic in the first trailer shows rather than being in a state of curse. With all of that said, let's continue with the next shot in this sequence showing Ganondorf's corpse rising. This is the first time we get a good frontal look at Ganondorf. There isn't much this shot adds to what we already saw in the first trailer, ranging from Gerudo jewelry he carries to his borderline mummified state. This shows Ganondorf in his awoken state, as seen by the Malice eyes being visible here, a continuation on how the first trailer ended. What is interesting to note is a set of details not previously visible, the holes on his chest and hands and what seems to be a hilt for a dagger. I can't pinpoint anything solid on these details. The best I can pull from this is the chest markings probably being the result of the hand sealing his corpse. In the first trailer, we see that same hand grabbing Link as he is about to fall down a hole, and in that shot, we can observe it having elongated fingers with long and pointy nails. Considering the hand sealing Ganondorf is in contact through a strong grip of his chest, it's reasonable to conclude the smaller holes around the large one as seen in this shot here might be scars of this very sealing state. The large hole in the middle could be where the Malice was leaking from as seen previously. While it's not as large a hole, this one does remind me of Twilight Princess Ganondorf's own scar from his execution scene and the game's final duel. I cannot imagine what could have caused the hole in the right hand here to be formed, so I leave that for your imagination. Before we proceed, I'd like to point a nice touch of symbolism that these first 10 seconds of trailer provide. The two shots I analyzed cement the premise for the game's conflict. Ganondorf is revived after his seal is removed or lost. This event is frightening to anyone familiar with the Zelda series, especially when considering the damage dealt by Calamity Ganon in Breath of the Wild, the most destructive state Hyrule has ever found itself in. The trailer opening with these two shots inserted in a sequence where thick malice grows from the side of the screen enhances the same malice serving as the symbol for the increasing threat that opens the game's story. Very nice touch. And with that, we can proceed with the trailer. As thick malice takes over the entire frame, the sequence in this dark environment ends as we see Zelda falling down a pit as the screen fades to black. What this event suggests for the game's story will be saved for the end portion of this video, but for now, it's worth pointing out how this sequence seems to show the continuation of this shot here in the first trailer as the ground below Zelda seems to fall down. This should be the final part of this trailer that provides direct continuity with the review trailer for the game, showcasing what should justify the separation between our protagonists for this adventure. And with that, let's continue. The scene transitions from a light growing from the center of the frame into a figure that is skydiving to a floating island above the clouds. The camera pans down to show the figure more closely to the right side, showing more of the cloudy environment. This might have been a short sequence, but there is already a lot to break down, so let's begin. Before exploring the actual content of the skydiving scene, I want to highlight the fantastic direction for transitions in this trailer. This scene happening right after Zelda falling down the pit alludes to Link jumping and falling down the pit to save Zelda. It's subtle, but the sequence of events isn't far-fetched, as the first trailer does point to Link falling down a hole of some kind before being saved by the magic hand. The act of falling that you would expect to happen afterwards is recontextualized to this new environment and scenery. And with that, we can talk about the figure skydiving in this scene. We can see he possesses long hair, donning a green cloak on his left arm, a golden gauntlet in his right arm, peculiar markings on his right arm and right portion of his torso, and a sort of Greek toga. This description is interesting because parts of it are reminiscent of two figures previously seen in the series. Mainly, the depiction of the hero from the legend that describes the events of the original Calamity taking place 10,000 years before the events of Breath of the Wild. The long hair and the green cloak covering the left arm here matches the perspective and representation provided by the tapestry detailing the 10,000-year-old legend seen in the game. Considering the context and the game's story, it's not unreasonable to suggest that this connection bears substantial meaning for the sequel. I'll explore this topic a bit later, so hold that thought for now. To a much lesser extent, the description laid out reminds me of Link's Ordonian attire in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, as the green cloak on the left arm is something shared between these two cases. Of course, I should reiterate that the connection here being made with the Ordonian attire lies strictly with visual elements. I am not implying that there is a lore connection necessarily. I will discuss a bit more about connections between the sequel to Breath of the Wild and other games in the series later on in this video. For now, the only connection I'm making here is strictly on a visual level. When comparing the aesthetics between the two, it's obvious that there are glaring differences. Of course, the Twilight Princess design that I'm comparing to is more akin to farmer gear from our own medieval times. On the other hand, the design that we're looking at here in the new trailer, as previously stated, looks more akin to Greek togas. And since we're on the topic of Greek togas, I think this is a good opportunity to point a nice little detail that might be relevant for the final game. If you look closely at the Ganondorf scene that I've analyzed earlier, you'll realize that Ganondorf is using a similar type of clothing as the figure is in this scene. While Ganondorf's costume is all torn and worn out by the passage of time, it's relevant to point out that it's possible to see remnants of a cloak that he also might have worn in his earlier life, as seen by the cloth wrapped around his left arm. With this small parallel noted, let's continue. With all the description detailed, I can finally address the topic of the identity of the figure in question. I avoided calling this figure Link specifically because it has come to my attention that a very prevalent theory running around suggests that this person is not the Link from Breath of the Wild, but rather the exact same hero from 10,000 years ago. This is further compounded by theories pertaining to time travel that rose from certain elements in this trailer, which we'll get to in due time. My belief is that this figure here is the same Link from Breath of the Wild and the trailers for the sequel released thus far. While some fans assumed this figure is the ancient hero of legend due to the long hair, it is important to recall that Link in Breath of the Wild also has long hair. It's easy to forget because most frequently he uses a ponytail with most of the gear in the original game, but we do see him with his hair loose when using the ancient armor, and it's not far from what we see in this new trailer here. Another thing pointing to the figure's identity is the gauntlet on the right arm and the markings. This is the same gauntlet from the first trailer worn by the hand-sealing Ganondorf, and the same arm we see Link suffering an attack from Malice and the phasing by the green magic in the first trailer. It is much more likely that this is the Link we know from Breath of the Wild, and he ends up getting a hold of the gauntlet after the sequel's opening. We even see later parts of the trailer showing Link in his champion's tunic, his most iconic attire from Breath of the Wild, using his right arm to ignite certain magical powers and abilities. To conclude this point, the attire here pointing to the ancient hero could easily be current-day Link acquiring the clothes through some story-related means. The protagonist inheriting the attire of a previous hero is not unheard of in the Zelda series. We've seen this same event play out in Twilight Princess, where Link gets a hold of the hero's tunic through one of the light spirits of Hyrule. In conclusion, the theory suggesting this skydiving figure being the ancient hero needs a lot more for it to be considered remotely likely. And with that, let me point to some details in the scene composition here worth highlighting. Firstly, right off the bat we get parallel imagery to The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword with this sequence through skydiving. The pose and how Link is falling through a circular opening through the clouds is reminiscent of Link descending from the sky as he jumps off his loft wing to go to the surface in that game. Considering the director of this game, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, is the same director that helmed Skyward Sword, it isn't unexpected to see more imagery from that game here. Whether we'll be seeing more lore content tied to it in the final game is left for your speculation. Speaking of Skyward Sword, this skydiving sequence does beg the question of where Link would be skydiving from. One reasonable theory could be a floating island like the one below Link that is behind the camera. We see numerous islands in different altitudes throughout the trailer, so it's plausible. Maybe we could be visiting the ruins of Skyloft and that's where we jump from? Another possible solution to this question would be Link jumping from something he rides on the sky before jumping, much like what is seen in Skyward Sword. Some wonder if we'll be seeing the Lost Wings return here, but I doubt that will be the case. From a lore-driven perspective, the Lost Wings haven't been around for a long time. We know this because of their lack of presence with the royal family of Hyrule, even in the time when the events of Wind Waker and even Twilight Princess played out in their respective timelines. Considering Lost Wings were so close to the family in the days of the foundation of the Kingdom of Hyrule, their disappearance implies something must have happened to them, either extinction or an evolution of some kind. Considering the games released thus far, I'm willing to believe the latter. Breath of the Wild's presentation of the Rito tribe does provide a potential answer to what happened. Going by the appearance of the Rito being humanoid birds, and their architecture, clothing, and artistry seeming to spring off from what is seen in Skyloft, it isn't far-fetched to perceive the Rito tribe as a race evolved from the Lost Wings. Breath of the Wild showing Link riding a Rito to reach the divine beast Va-Metal does make this parallel as well. In fact, this parallel points to a potential answer for our earlier question of where Link jumps from. Considering the numerous altitudes of islands to be explored, one of the potential means of transportation that could be made available at some point in the adventure would be riding a Rito to traverse the skies. So maybe this scene in the trailer shows Link skydiving after dropping off from a Rito, much like how Link drops off from Lost Wings in Skyward Sword. Alright, that should be enough theorizing for now. Let's continue with the rest of the details that both this scene and the next two shots provide. We get some glimpses of this set of floating islands with golden trees and foliage scattered around the top of the land masses, with some paved paths visible from the skydiving sequence here. It's interesting to note the set of structures that seem to be scattered around the edges of these islands, as seen here, as well as on the right edge of the Green Golem shot here, as well as in the white shot near the end of the trailer here. There's also an easy to miss glimpse of the rooftop of what looks like a temple built under the molds of Japanese castles of the 16th century, the very same source of inspiration that is present in Breath of the Wild's sister game, Super Mario Odyssey, in the form of Bowser's castle amidst the colorful clouds in the sky. This temple is better seen in the next shot of Link paragliding at night here. Maybe it's a traditional style dungeon for us to complete? In the topic of this nighttime sequence, there are a couple of details worth pointing out with regards to lore. The paraglider's design here is significantly different from the one seen in Breath of the Wild, with the wings here matching more closely the Hylian crest, pointing to it being a completely new paraglider Link obtains in the story. His shield in this shot and the following scene is also very interesting to observe. The design here looks slightly reminiscent to the Sheikah eye, down to the 3 eyelashes to the top. But there are some differences here that caught my attention, and I can't help but wonder if they are somehow related to the lore surrounding the main story of the sequel or the civilization behind these floating islands. The eye here does not feature the teardrop that is iconic to the Sheikah iconography, instead having 3 eyelashes in its place. The eye looking upwards is also something that Zelda fans might be familiar with. Eyes in the Zelda series aren't unique to the Sheikah, commonly seen in iconography of villains' lairs, spots to shoot arrows with, and boss keys in dungeons. However, the eye looking upwards is a much rarer sight. The only instance of this imagery that comes to my mind is the eye symbol associated to Vati in the mural present in the Four Swords Sanctuary and on the entrance of the Palace of the Winds, seen in the Legend of Zelda Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures. Curiously, that mural features a squared spiral pattern that seems vaguely present on the ends of the design below the eye on the shield here, as well as on the Green Golem, which we'll analyze soon. In addition, it's interesting to note that the aforementioned Four Swords Sanctuary served as a pathway to the Tower of Winds, which granted access to the Realm of the Heavens, where Vati's lair resides. Whether this imagery and architecture is tied to the civilization responsible for the floating islands present here or whether Vati will return remains to be seen, but the possible connections are definitely enticing. And with that, let's continue. The trailer shows a Green Golem getting sorted, possibly for battle. This is the first good look we get of a denizen of this place, and possibly a look at a new foe to face in the game. The scene composition here should provide some very interesting details, so let's break it down. For starters, let's look at the golem itself. In the beginning of this sequence we can see its head being connected to a body part by a green essence. This essence looks uncannily similar to the green essence that composed the sealing magic on Ganondorf seen in both trailers for this game. I wouldn't say it's far-fetched to believe that the essence seen in both trailers are the same, which implies that the ones who are responsible for sealing Ganondorf are the same people that built this golem and most likely are denizens of this set of sky islands. Another detail worth pointing out with the golem's design is the set of earring-like stonework present on the sides of its head here. Right below the arc that connects this stonework to the head, you can make out an eye symbol. Considering the centerpiece on the upper part and the 3 eyelashes below, this seems to mirror the eye symbol present in the shield design I analyzed earlier. This is yet again an eye looking upwards, iconography not common in the series. What calls my attention here is the squared spiral, previously mentioned as part of the pattern below the eye on the shield in question, is the pattern that determines the edges of the eye here. It's worth mentioning that this pattern here is in the opposite direction of the Vati eye seen in the Four Sword Sanctuary. What this is supposed to mean or whether these are related to begin with is left for your imagination. But what we can say for sure is that this is yet another instance where the squared spiral imagery is tied to architecture and culture of denizens of the sky in the series. On the topic of the eye imagery, this golem also seems to feature a central golden eye looking downwards to the camera, an interesting contrast to the upwards looking eyes seen on the sides. Some say that the 2 holes here are also eyes for the golem, which makes this golem a 3-eyed creature. This could be an interesting detail because 3-eyed beings have been historically used to represent entities with high spiritual conscience and power. It would imply the spiritual power of the golem's creators and the nature of the Skylands. Moving on, we also get a glimpse of a symbol on the center of the body part of the golem. I'm unable to pinpoint anything in the series that is related to this symbol, so it seems to be completely new imagery for the game to use and explore. On the right side of the frame, as previously said, we get a glimpse of the structure that is commonly seen on the edge of the Sky Islands. You can also make out some carvings on the top of the structure, but let's save this for the end. One glaring detail in this shot that I want to highlight before continuing with the trailer is the significant presence of pine cones here. We can see a pair of white pine cones on the sides of the golem here, as well as on the top of the pillars present in the scene on the right side of the frame here and here. These pine cones are also present on the wide shot of the Sky Islands near the end of the trailer on the 2 pillars that are beside the stairway to this peculiar structure. Whatever these pine cones mean, their prominent presence suggests these are important symbols to the denizens responsible for the structures around these skylands. While these would look like new imagery in the series to many, the pinecone structure is actually not entirely foreign to the Zelda series. There is only one instance of a similar pinecone structure that comes to mind and is a curious case considering where it finds itself. The golden pinecone structure that lies at the top of the central building of the City in the Sky in The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. It has been long theorized that this place is part of the remnants of Skyloft, occupied by a highly advanced race known as the Uka, said to be the closest beings to the gods. A detail that curiously lends credence to my assessment on the spirituality symbolized by the golem's design. This civilization has never been revisited in the series, and is the most recent iteration of sky-dwelling people, considering the realm of the heavens and the Sky Palace are places occupied by Vati and his minions, with no civilization visible. The sequel to Breath of the Wild could finally give an update to the state of the Sky civilization, and it is interesting to consider that the Sky Islands and the civilization behind this tech could possibly be the offspring of the Uka from Twilight Princess. And with that, let's continue with the analysis. The trailer continues as we see a panning shot around Link as he paraglides by a Bokoblin fortress, which rises from the ground as we see it being tied to a stone talus that awakens to chase Link. This small sequence shows some very interesting details on how the sequel to Breath of the Wild seems to shake up its traditional encounters with enemies and hints at some changes to the overworld. So let's look at each of them. Firstly, we see Bokoblins here featuring a design change, featuring horns seen in Moblins of the previous game. It's subtle, but the original Bokoblins featured a very small horn, suggesting these ones are older and more experienced. Maybe this hints at tougher versions of the enemy selection seen in the previous game. Raising the difficulty doesn't seem to be restricted to just enemies themselves, but also with regards to fortresses. We can see here that gliding to some fortresses will be met with wooden walls that prevent engagements from players from certain sides. More than ever, the player will have to strategize on the direction of the first attack, if they don't wish to drop directly from above. On top of all this, there might be a higher commitment to attacking fortresses considering they are now mobile because of a stone talus carrying them. We can see here the stone talus's weak point is right on the platform here. No ladders are seen to scale the fortress, so either the player has to glide to it or risk getting on the talus and not get hit by arrows while avoiding the pointy logs on the bottom here. Quite an interesting remix of old concepts already. We also get a glimpse of some rock formations on the left of the frame in the very beginning of the sequence, very close to the Lon Lon Ranch ruins. The linear outlines of the rocks can point to their origin, which is something I didn't talk about yet from the previous scenes. The Sky Island's own formation. In all shots of the islands that we can see their bottom portions, it's noticeable how the rock formations that define their base possess straight edges. Anyone familiar with rock formations of any kind knows that natural formations tend to be defined by irregular and curved surfaces, which leads me to believe these islands have these bases carved by the Sky Civilization or is a result of a divine creation. The rock formation in the scene with Link paragliding here features this exact same feature, and if you're wondering if those were there before, I asked my friend ST to provide me footage going to the exact spot on the map where this scene takes place, and as you can see, there is no sign of these rock formations around. This implies we'll find new formations and features throughout the familiar land of Hyrule. How will these things change the overall experience is still unknown, so we can only speculate. To close things off with the sequence, there is a massive thing here missing in the landscape. See if you can spot it. Did you catch it? Okay, outside the Divine Beast missing here and the Sheikah Tower missing here. If you look to the left of the frame in the beginning of the sequence, you'll see the glaring omission of the Great Deku Tree. I can't be sure if the entirety of the Lost Woods disappeared here, but the absence of the Great Deku Tree is very intriguing nonetheless. Could it be related to the Sky Islands? Maybe it rose to keep the Master Sword's resting place safe? After all, throughout the entire trailer after the rise of Ganondorf, we don't see Link carrying the Sword of Evil's Bane anymore, instead donning the Traveler's gear, implying a potential loss of access to it due to the game's opening sequence. There are numerous possibilities for now. What I'm kind of hoping for the most is to see this being related to the theory surrounding the Great Plateau and the Lost Woods sharing a similar shape of land, possibly having switched places in the past. The Temple of Time and the ruins of Hyrule Castle from Ocarina of Time being this far south on the map suggests this landmass might have been moved by mysterious means. Considering we observe landmasses float in the sky, possibly by virtue of technology, I have to wonder if this is the case for the Great Plateau and the Lost Woods. Maybe the final game will give us answers to these questions. Fingers crossed. And with that, let's continue with the analysis. The trailer continues with a sequence showing the activation of the gauntlet on Link's arm. This is the best shot we have to observe the gauntlet and Link's arm after diffusing with the green essence shown in the first trailer. The green magic is seen here once again, making the markings on Link's arm glow with the same green of the hand that sealed Ganondorf. The patterns that light up the gauntlet as it activates is fascinating when considering how much it shares with the patterns seen in Twilight architecture and imagery seen in Twilight Princess. The green light here is also something that is present in both cases, and it begs the question whether this tool, likely connected to the people in the sky, are also connected to the Twilight. We don't have much connecting them, but the squared spiral pattern that is present in the iconography of the Sky People is interestingly present on the throne of the head of royalty of the Twilight race. Something to keep in mind. One final parallel before moving on with the analysis. While we see only a very limited portion of the Twilight Realm in Twilight Princess, the Palace of Twilight and neighboring lands are all located on top of floating islands in the sky. While the rock formations are different from the ones seen in the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, it's still relevant to point out that this is the only case outside the Sky People where a race built a civilization on floating islands, be it by technology or magic. Whether this connection will bear fruit in this new entry in the series, we'll just have to wait and see. And with that, let's continue. Right below the arm here we can see a set of ideograms that circle around the base where Link is laid down. These letters aren't something I was able to pinpoint any direct source for. The closest I got to finding a similarity is with the ideogram here with this sky letter seen in the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. While there isn't any concrete answer to what these ideograms translate to and where they come from, I have seen theories pointing to these letters being related to the letters that come out of the ceiling hand seen in the first trailer. And some people believe that, curiously, these ideograms were inspired by seal script, an ancient style of representation of Chinese ideograms. The letters here, potentially tied to the ceiling hand being inspired by seal script, is definitely a poetic detail, if true. I'm no expert on language history, much less on Chinese language in general, so I'll leave that for the viewers familiar with these concepts to determine whether these theories make sense. Moving on, we get a scene where Link shows the Gauntlet's magical abilities in action, granting here the power of reversing the trajectory of objects. This should point to us that the Gauntlet grants abilities that are significantly different from what the Sheikah Slate provided in the first game. This should completely recontextualize how the player traverses through the world and the technical feats that they are able to perform. I'm sorry, bomb launching bros, but I'm afraid we might not be able to have Link adventure through Hyrule with this tech. But who knows, we might find something even better with the Gauntlet. Anyways, this set of abilities should provide a completely new approach to gameplay that should recontextualize the world and the experience. This is a good sign for a sequel that takes so much from its predecessor in terms of assets and engine. With regards to the rest of the sequence, it's interesting how they use the black and white effect to represent a manipulation of time to influence the object. This effect used to convey time manipulation has been seen before in The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, with Hyrule being in a state of time being frozen. Very nice touch. Another thing that caught my eye is this Moblin redesign. I have no idea how that huge horn of his fits in that silly small helmet, unless it's not a helmet but instead part of his actual morphology. But I can't help but find this version of the Moblin hilarious to look at. I kinda like it. Moving on, the next scene shows Link facing a new beast in an environment that is reminiscent of a traditional Zelda dungeon. Let's break down the sequence. Right off the bat we get a look at a new weapon, a flamethrower in the form of a dragon head. Curiously, this tool is attached to Link's shield here, probably the Traveler's shield we've seen in other parts of the trailer. How this will change defensive play in combat is up in the air, but this does open the possibility for other types of attachments we could see on shields to enhance the scope of abilities Link will be able to use in battle. The flamethrower here is also interesting for its design. Taking a closer look, we can see some traces of it being reminiscent to the dragon head seen in Zonai architecture present in Breath of the Wild. It's not a perfect match though, as seen by the earpieces here and the frontal pointy teeth on the piece here. But the circular patterns here give away its Zonai origin. It seems from this that we'll be having even more contact with Zonai tools and maybe even more of their history. Looking at its insides in the middle of Link's backflip here also shows a familiar green energy, potentially tying the makers of this tool, the Zonai, to the green magic scene with the Green Golem of the Sky and the Ceiling Hand and Gauntlet. To fully cement this connection, if you are a keen-eyed viewer, you might have noticed earlier when I analyzed the Green Golem's central body part that I've avoided talking about the white parts surrounding the emblem. This is because if you pay attention to the markings, you'll realize that the body part in question actually looks a lot like a dragon's jaw, very similarly designed like the dragon head attached to Link's shield. You can even see the frontal teeth here and the pointy teeth on the back on the sides here. Again, a design detail that connects the Zonai to the makers of the Green Golem. Very interesting potential lore here to be discovered. Looking at the enemy here, we can see it's slightly similar to the colored tail enemies from the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. To conclude on the topic of this scene, let's analyze the environment. This is the type of place seen in normal Zelda dungeons. You can tell by the space being enclosed, something that is rarely seen in Breath of the Wild. Enclosed spaces are usually restricted in that game to houses and establishments in villages, divine beasts, and Sheikah shrines. What makes me see this place as a traditional Zelda dungeon is the stairway to the pedestal seen here. This type of room layout is common with dungeons in the series, usually reserved to places where you solve a puzzle or defeat an enemy wave to get some loot from a treasure chest. We don't see any treasure chest on the pedestal, which makes me believe the treasure in this room is the very dragon flamethrower Link attached to his shield here. Finally, if we look around the room, we can notice some very peculiar stonework with markings on them. If you're a keen-eyed viewer, you may have noticed that these are pretty much the same ones seen on the stone structures in the sky as seen with the Green Golem scene here, as well as the wide shot sequence we'll be analyzing shortly. This implies this place was built or had been occupied by the ones responsible for the constructions seen in the Sky Islands. Considering the trailers so far, this place should be located in one of the following places, the first of which would be the underground caves below Hyrule Castle where Link and Zelda seem to find Ganondorf's remains. We see Zonai structures in the first trailer throughout the environment as our heroes make their way to find Ganondorf's corpse. So considering the ties between the Zonai and the sky structures established in this analysis, it's not absurd to imagine these stone structures could be in these caves as well. Probably the most likely location, however, would be the temple that I pointed to in the beginning of the trailer. The place lies in the Sky Islands and seems to have the scale of what you would expect from a traditional Zelda dungeon. So structures like these are to be expected in that environment. Whichever option it is, this place is definitely connected to the Sky Folk. And with that, let's continue by analyzing the next two sequences for the trailer. We see a shot where a small pool of water is condensed to a single drop of water rising to the air, almost like time is reversed here. People have taken this sequence as a point towards time travel because of its apparent lack of connections to anything else in the trailer. However, I beg to differ. This shot seems to show a glimpse of another ability Link acquires through the gauntlet, the ability to rise and phase through ceilings. We can potentially see this in the next sequence, where Link rises up in the air before passing through stone and coming out on the other side. We can see a rippling water effect as Link has his upper body outside the ground, almost like he is inside a small pool of green water created on the surface. If you are aware of how Nintendo directs the trailers for their major future titles, you would know that they frequently showcase major gameplay additions in chunks throughout the trailer, with examples of it in action as well as the associated imagery to them. I think this is the case here, as this water drop scene transitions directly into the next shot with visual elements that are common between the two shots. Nowhere else in the trailers can you find a parallel to this shot here, so it's likely this is Nintendo illustrating a major gameplay addition that they want to highlight in the game. I can't see this footage of the water drop serving the purpose of pointing to time travel as part of the main story, when this imagery has been seen before in the series as well. In Twilight Princess, we can see the light spirits appearing right after a water drop shoots upwards as if time has reversed on their spring. If a Twilight Princess trailer showed that exact footage and people used that same line of reasoning for the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, they would be disappointed to realize that the main plot featured no time travel as the driving force for its progression. So I refrain myself from thinking this clip here means anything major for the story. Looking at the rest of the wide shot here, we can observe the previously described pine cone on the pillar here and some interesting patterns on the inside walls of these bordering structures here. It's interesting to note how the other Sky Islands possess numerous structures that are strikingly similar to buildings akin to Shinto shrines, as seen here, here, and here, as well as a peculiar gate here and here, resembling a Tori gate, imagery associated to entry of a sacred place in Shinto religion. These same gates are also seemingly visible in this earlier shot here and here. Perhaps more interestingly, we can notice how these specific Sky Islands are located in relation to Hyrule. Looking down below, we can see the Gerudo Highlands here and the iconic mushroom-shaped trees on the bottom here characteristic of the Ridgeland region. This is clearly Sarisk Scablands, as you can see the Illumeni Plateau here, the Tamitha region starting here, and the plateau where you fight the Lynel here. Looking from the Tamitha bridge, you would be able to see the islands floating right here. Speaking of the plateau we fight a Lynel in, a theory arose from this shot provided by Masked Nintendo Bandit surrounding the absence of some landmarks here and what they could imply for the main story. Here are some clips of his explanation.
Guys, very quickly, is that there is something missing from Hyrule as shown in the recent trailer. If you look at the rightmost hill pictured here, which would be the southwestern portion of the Hyrule Ridge, you'll notice that this middle platform in this hill is missing Zonai pillars. Here are the screenshots that I already uploaded to Twitter with the pillars that I'm talking about circled in red. As you can see, they are very clearly present on this middle platform in the game Breath of the Wild, but yet in the trailer they are nowhere to be found. And there's 5 of them, and they're pretty decently sized, so we should be able to see them. But as we can see in the trailer, there is absolutely nothing there. Now what this tells me is that there's a very good possibility that what we are looking at right here is not Hyrule as we know it in the main game, but rather an older version of Hyrule, an ancient version of Hyrule, since those pillars would have been man-made, and this appears to be before they were made.
This sounded absolutely fascinating to me, but then it dawned onto me that the absence of the pillars here could easily be tied to rendering distance from the Switch not allowing them to be visible. And thus, I decided to investigate this, once again, with my good friend ST. Firstly, we went to check on the plateau again and noticed that those pillars aren't Zonai made, but instead Ancient Hylian, as seen by the emblem here present in the sealed temple from Skyward Sword, iconic of Ancient Hylian architecture, and the loft-wing profile carved here, present in the Forgotten Temple scene in Breath of the Wild, also an Ancient Hylian work. From the plateau, we went to the mounted archery camp near Faron Woods to ignite the infinite jump glitch, afterwards teleporting to the shrine in the Thundra Plateau, and from there we jumped as high as we could to reach a perspective similar to what we see in the trailer in an altitude that doesn't blur everything with a snowstorm. Keep in mind, this is far closer to the place in question than the islands are to that place, and as you can see here, the pillars aren't visible. In fact, they weren't visible even when we were close to the same altitude as the plateau in question. So it's unlikely the absence of the pillars seen here in the trailer is intentional or pointing to any story-related detail. With that theory addressed, let's conclude our analysis with the remaining content the trailer provides. As this sequence reaches its conclusion, a vocal track in reverse starts playing as the scene transitions into a shot showing Hyrule Castle rising from the ground as a thick red Malice pushes it upwards, concluding with a wide shot of Hyrule Castle floating in the air with Malice underneath it in front of a sunset. This sequence shows the conclusion of the game's premise. As Ganondorf returns, his power grows and is able to raise Hyrule Castle out of reach from the rest of the world. This wide shot also shows a rather disappointing fact about Breath of the Wild's sequel. The game won't provide a glimpse of Hyrule's establishment being rebuilt. Hyrule Castle Town ruins looks identical here, which is an enormous shame for me, as one of the things I looked forward to the most with this game was seeing more towns and buildings returning to their former glory before the kingdom fell to the calamity. I wanted to see Breath of the Wild's version of Castletown, an expanded version of Twilight Princess's take on this urban space, which could have served as a hub for tons of side quests to indulge in. Instead, this experience is left only teased in the game that shall not be named. Another detail worth pointing here is that from this perspective we do see the Ridgeland region here, but no sign of the Sky Islands up top here. Maybe they are meant to be invisible from Hyrule's surface? Numerous places in the Zelda series already provide precedent for this to be a real possibility. Skyward Sword had a cloud barrier that is only seen from the world of the sky where Skyloft resides. None of the Sky Islands nor the cloud barrier is visible from the surface. This could be the case in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Maybe this is where the dragon spirits in that game went, as you could see a portal open in the sky. Another place that is relevant and is also a source for a popular theory now is the Sacred Realm itself. Considering the symbolism that the torii-like gates provide in terms of being gates to a sacred place, the golden trees, and the structures seen in the art for the sacred place in A Link to the Past, it isn't far-fetched to assume the Sky Islands in this trailer lie in the Sacred Realm. The Sacred Realm has historically always been a space that coexisted with Hyrule in a different plane of existence. The Light Temple in Ocarina of Time, the Silent Realm in Skyward Sword, and the Temple of Time in Twilight Princess pointed to this idea as well. The Great Plateau with the Temple of Time rising to this plane as suggested earlier in this analysis would be a poetic parallel to this concept. The idea of these Sky Islands not being visible from the surface is coherent with a space that fits the description of the Sacred Realm, but more evidence is needed to make this theory become a likely outcome. It could easily just be the Sky Islands from Skyward Sword unrelated to the Sacred Realm, unless this game points to the sky from Skyward Sword as being the Sacred Realm itself. Actually, now that I think of it, spoiler alert for Skyward Sword, but the pieces of the Triforce is found in Skykeep, right below the goddess statue beside Skyloft. This might actually make sense. Alright, you get the idea. Let's get back to the analysis of this final scene. Originally, I was going to use this part of the video to address the music present in this segment of the trailer, how there might be issues with the general fan perception of it, and a comment on the orchestral theme for the game. However, as I was editing this video, 2 videos came out that perfectly summarize this topic brilliantly, and I can't recommend these videos enough. Those are Tim Demand's The Musical Time Loop and Monster Mazes Are There Secrets in Breath of the Wild 2's music. Both are fantastic channels and I highly suggest you check them out if you haven't already. Finally, I want to conclude this analysis with a commentary on what the floating castle points to in terms of the game's story and how it relates to the development history of its predecessor. This isn't the first time we see Hyrule Castle rising in these trailers. In fact, the game's reveal trailer ended on this very event, curiously during daytime rather than dusk seen here. Considering that the castle rising served as the ending for both trailers released for the game, it's obvious that this event is core to the game's story, and I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being part of the title's logo. But perhaps the most important thing about the castle rising from the ground is how it relates to scrapped content from Breath of the Wild. Originally, that game would have you face Ganondorf on Death Mountain, a nice nod to the original Legend of Zelda, as the landmass floated in the air. This concept seems to have finally become a reality with the sequel, with Hyrule Castle instead of Death Mountain. If they take this concept all the way home, Ganondorf being on Death Mountain in the plans would imply that Ganondorf is to be found in Hyrule Castle, an interesting callback to Twilight Princess. This trailer shows that this game exists because Nintendo saw a lot of potential in the cut content for Breath of the Wild. Even the original concept for Link's abilities that ended up being the Sheikah Slate in that game originally was meant to be an arm extension that provided Link tons of abilities and tools. That arm tool most likely became the gauntlet we see in the sequel. If you want to have some ideas on what could land in this game, do keep your eyes open on what is shown in the book The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild Masterworks, known as Creating a Champion in the West. I just hope they never touch Rockstar Link here. Oh god. But if Nintendo EPD's history is anything to go by, a game being sprung from this type of situation could end up being fantastic. Super Mario Galaxy 2, a game I would argue is a good contender to be the greatest game of all time, was made as an offspring from the huge amount of ideas that the team could not add in time for Super Mario Galaxy. With the developer's history, the lore the series has built with consistency, and the footage shown thus far, I'm not afraid to say that the sequel to Breath of the Wild is easily my most anticipated game in general. And with that, allow me to close out this video with a short speculation segment based on what this trailer provided with content. It is staggering how much more potential connections to past Zelda lore we got from this single trailer. It is my belief that this game will explore the Sky Islands to illustrate a huge chunk of Hyrule's history left unexplained by the first game, and that includes the Zonai, said to have disappeared thousands of years prior to the game's events, a time frame that isn't specified but likely could be around the same time the very first calamity rose, going by the 10,000-year-old legend. Link's attire and look being visually similar to the depiction of the ancient hero further supports this idea. I believe the game will open with Link and Zelda a few months after the first game's ending, discovering some ancient text that alludes to the calamity having a source and that Hyrule's future runs the danger of falling once again by its return. This motivates our heroes to go on a journey to annihilate it. They end up finding Ganondorf's corpse sealed with Malice leaking out of his body. As Link gets close to the corpse, the Malice attacks Link's arm, which ignites the magic hand to leave its sealing spot to counter the Malice attempting to use Link as his vessel. With the removal of the seal, Ganondorf is unrestrained and rises back into power, as his corpse is revived after a slumber of over 10,000 years. His power makes the chamber fall apart, making our heroes separate and fall down, with the Master Sword being lost and possibly returning to its resting place, maybe like the cut animation of it seen in Breath of the Wild. Ganondorf goes to Hyrule Castle, which leads to where we see the Malice levitating the structure here. His Malice tries to cause havoc in specific areas of the land, causing the Great Deku Tree and the Lost Woods to disappear or rise to the sky. Link is taken by the hand that saved him to a hidden place, granting him the use of the gauntlet and the powers that come from it. If you're wondering what happened to the mechanics that the Sheikah Slate provided, I can tell you I imagine that they won't be thrown in the trash. After all, these took years to develop for the first game, so I imagine they would be relevant in the sequel in some form. And I think I know how. Link uses a slate in Breath of the Wild, but that slate is not his, it's Zelda's, which makes me believe she might be carrying it in the game's opening. Her falling down would probably lead her to more underground caverns and secrets that will provide her knowledge and tools to help defeat Ganondorf at the end of the game. I believe that we might be able to play these sequences as Zelda using the Sheikah Slate to solve puzzles in specific parts of the story. It is no secret that the series producer Eiji Aonuma has recognized demands from certain fans of Zelda being playable in some form. While he rightfully acknowledged the importance of Link being the central character, he expressed his interest in studying ways to implement this concept in some form in the future. And I think this is the best possible moment to do it. It even plays into the lore, considering the time passed between games. I imagine Link would have taught her how to use the slate during this time, and she would have put this knowledge to good use moving forward. With regards to the general lore of the game, it is relevant to point out how much this game alludes to different people and cultures that are familiar to Zelda fans. The Zonai have long been the most theorized and talked about topic in the fandom, frequently taken for granted that they would appear and possibly be relevant to the game's story since the reveal trailer showing numerous Zonai ruins in the underground caves. This new trailer further supports this notion, with the Zonai Dragon flamethrower here, the ties to the green energy present since the first trailer branching off into other elements here, from the new gauntlet to the Green Golem in the heavens. This tie to the heavens begs the question of how much they should be related to the sky people depicted in the past. I imagine the Zonai ended up disappearing because of their rise to the sky, giving continuity to a civilization that prospered from the technological marvels of the Uka. The patterns present in the trailer also alluded to ties to the Twili and the sky people seen in Minish Cap. Would the Zonai be descendants of one of these races? Which leads to my final speculation point. I'm not here to make an argument for the Zelda timeline as understood by material like Hyrule Historia or Zelda Encyclopedia. I'll save the extensive discussion on this topic for a future video. For now, I just want to lay out my thoughts on how this game and its prequel seem to relate to other games. My experience with the first game has made me reflect on how references can carry very different weights of importance to world building, and tested how far one can reason timeline placements into it. Breath of the Wild takes place at least over 10,000 years after the events of the last games in the respective existing timelines. That is the biggest time gap ever seen in the Zelda series. Adapting to our own reality, this is prehistory times, right around the Mesolithic period. And that's considering the minimum time passed. A ton of things could have happened during this time. But of course, there are some significant contextual differences between the history of this world and ours, starting with a regime keeping track of its history and legends lasting over 10,000 years. This implies that certain historical acknowledgements of certain time periods in the game imply the demand of other time periods and type of events needing to also be acknowledged and well known. Right now, Nintendo has created such a large time gap that they could pull any new type of story to place Breath of the Wild into a specific timeline, but it doesn't remove the validity of assessing what timeline makes the most sense with the information we currently have at hand. I'll explore all of these elements in detail once my video series on Breath of the Wild begins, but for now, I'll ask for your patience as you hear my conclusion before the series is out. Considering the history of races, the evolution of cultures throughout the history of Hyrule, the manner in which specific Zelda stories are acknowledged, and the amount of alignments with specific timeline events, I fell under the impression that the child timeline made the most sense for a timeline placement. With the numerous potential nods in this new trailer to lore that is central to titles in the child timeline, I can't help but feel this impression might be intensified with the sequel. I might be wrong, but it's certainly interesting to find more connections to past titles being made with this new entry. I have a passion for exploring the rich lore of the world of The Legend of Zelda, and each major entry is a treasure trove of content to indulge in for years. If you, fair viewer, have a different perspective and ideas on the trailer and how it relates to Zelda's timeline, if you take it as a thing anyways, do share your thoughts on the comments below. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching it through the end. If you liked my content, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and hit the bell icon for more Zelda content in the future. Trust me when I say I have big plans for this series for my channel. If you love games and art in general, don't hesitate to explore my other content. I aim to focus on in-depth and well-researched videos analyzing audiovisual media and numerous topics relating to it. If you are into this type of thing, you'll love what I have to offer. And please do consider supporting me on Patreon. It's the only way I can make this a career and get videos out faster, as I'm occupied with a separate job trying to make ends meet in these harsh times. Even a monthly donation of just $5 can go a long way. I mean, for comparison's sake, you'd be donating far less per year than you would pay for a yearly subscription of Netflix or Amazon Prime. So again, please consider supporting me through the link in the description. For the making of this video, I want to give my special thanks to my distinguished patron, O Hobbit. I also want to thank my good friend ST for providing me the majority of footage of the original Breath of the Wild, including visiting places seen in the new trailer. I couldn't have made this video the way it turned out without him. Thank you to Nintendo Black Crisis, Master Nintendo Bandit, Post Game Boss, Team Deman, Nintendan NC, Zelda Dungeon, and Great Bit Arcade for the extra footage used in this video. And finally, I hope that you, kind viewer, enjoyed this analysis and stay tuned for more content to come soon. Until then, I bid you all farewell. Have a good one.